conversation about how to ensure equitable access to higher education in the landscape that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to just introduce the panelists really quickly. We have Dr. Bill Davis, who is Vice Provost of Academic Engagement and Student Achievement at Washington State University. Dr. Julie Passelt, who's Executive Director of the USC CERPP. And Brian Cook is Director of Higher Education Policy at the Urban Institute. He was not able to present today. So in his stead, we have Victoria Nelson, who's a policy analyst at the Urban Institute, who will be moderating the conversation. Victoria, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Julia just greatly introduced me, my name is Victoria Nelson. I'm a policy analyst at the Urban Institute, and I have the honor of providing a brief overview of the project currently. So the Urban Institute is working with the Center for Enrollment Research, Policy and Practice at the University of Southern California and UERU to launch a national research practice partnership to explore the future of college admissions in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling to overturn the use of affirmative action in college admissions. This fall, as we all know, the admission cycle was also affected by challenges with the new FAFSA rollout. But we launched this project because we cannot understand currently how admissions policies and applicant demographics have changed with national publicly available data. Little systemic data currently are collected on admissions practices and policies, and no national data exists on applicants and admits by race or income. And data on the demographics of enrollees is often delayed in terms of when it is released. And so while the U.S. Department of Education is scheduled to begin collecting some of this data beginning in 2025 to 2026, it's unclear how the results of the election may impact this. And even if we do start getting data in 2025, it won't provide us with that historical data to understand the impact of the Supreme Court's decision and the FAFSA rollout challenges. So our research project has two main goals. The first goal is to understand the changes in the demographic profile of applicants, admits, and enrollees. And we're doing this through recruiting schools to submit aggregate data on their applicants, admits, and enrollees disaggregated by race and ethnicity from 2018 to 2024. The second goal of our project is to contextualize what we are seeing in the data and provide institutional context through exploring changes in school admissions policies and practices. So right now, our current focus is on recruiting universities to submit their data. And as of today, approximately 30 universities have either submitted data or committed to submit their data. The universities represent a mix of private and public schools and a range of admissions selectivity. We're still digging into the data of those who have submitted their data so far, but we have heard a few things in the recruitment process that I thought would be great to share with you all today. First, a lot of universities are fearful of political and/or legal backlash, and this is especially true in states where there has been an increase in anti-DEI legislation. Second, less selective institutions believed that they would not feel as much of an effect of the Supreme Court ruling around affirmative action, but we know that less selective schools were impacted after California banned affirmative action in the mid-1990s, and so these institutions are equally important to our project and the broader research in the field. Third is that universities are seeing an increase in students who are identifying as race unknown or two or more races, which does affect how we interpret the numbers that we're seeing in terms of enrollment and how they're changing over time. Again, we're still in the process of recruiting universities to submit data, and so there's a lot more that we can learn over the coming months. But if you are interested in participating in this project, please contact Julia Michaels, and we can connect with you to facilitate your university submitting data. All data is transferred and stored securely, and we can also offer universities anonymity if you would prefer not to be named as a participant in the study. I am now going to turn to asking our panelists some questions about how universities can and are supporting equitable access for all students. Thank you. And again, please reach out to Julia if you're interested in participating in our study. So I'll turn it over. Our first question is for you, Bill. Can you tell us a little bit about Washington State and the types of students that you serve? What are some of the challenges related to access that you've been experiencing?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow UERU participants and with you, Victoria. So Washington State is on the eastern side of Washington. We are an 1890 land grant institution. So we have 6 campuses, 5 physical campuses across the state, 1 global campus that delivers our online education. We have extension offices in every county in the state. And so we do a lot of formal education and a lot of certificate and lifetime education as well across all of our constituencies. As far as our undergraduate student population goes, we heavily serve the people of Washington State. 83% of our students come from in-state. And so our student population will often mirror the demographics of our state. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important here in just a few minutes. As far as other groups of interest, our low income or Pell students usually are around 30% of our student population. Our first generation population fluctuates between 35 and 40% of our first year class. And our minority students tend to come in at about 25% of our entering class. Some things to understand about Washington State is we were one of the first states after California to enact essentially a ban on race-based admissions into higher education in our state. So California passed Prop 209 in 1996. We followed in 1998 here in our state with what was called Initiative 200. And Initiative 200, I'll read it. So it says the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public education. Since that time, there's been a couple of motions to at least overturn part of that, including one in 2018 and 2019, but that was narrowly defeated by a majority of people. And so that ban on using ethnicity, race, color, sex, any of those attributes in admissions processes have been banned for us for now well over 25 years at WSU. And what we've seen in the meantime is actually really interesting in terms of what's happened with our student demographics. And part of the reason why I'm excited to be a part of this project is I'm curious to see what's going to be happening at other institutions as this goes out to the national level. You talked a little bit about what happened in California, especially with lesser selectivity schools. I would say we're a medium selectivity school. We do have minimum admission standards, and I'll talk a little bit about those here in a minute. But they are not. We're not open access like some of the other institutes in our state, but we're also not highly restrictive as well. One of the things that we've observed since the enactment of Initiative 200 is that our population of minority students has actually increased over time, as has our number of Pell students and our number of first generation students. Part of that mirrors the demographic changes in Washington State between 2000 and 2022, where the population of Hispanic, African American, and mixed race individuals, according to US Census data, increased by a significant amount. We started to see increases in minority student enrollment at WSU around the time of the last pandemic, though. So there looks like there was this 10-year lag where our student population didn't really change in terms of our entering class demographics for quite some time. And then at the last recession or about that time, it seems like that was when things really started to take off. And some of the demographic changes in the state were already happening prior to that, according to the census data. So I don't know why that lag exists in our data, but it'd be really interesting to see if other institutions had something similar. If you're in a state, and there's only about 8 right now that have a ban that looks like that. So as far as who we admit and how we admit them, we have several different programs, but many of them are actually fairly new. And so all of these changes that I talked about in demographics in our students, despite the ban on being able to use race or other attributes preferentially, actually were happening well before that time period. And so right now we have a program at the state level that's called the Washington Guaranteed Admissions Program that allows entry for students out of Washington high schools, if they have a minimum high school GPA of 3.0, complete a set of requirements as far as their academic preparation for college, and their school district is signed on to the program. For other students, our admissions criteria are we're a test not considered. So even if a student submits a standardized test score, we don't even look at it in our admissions process. We have a minimum high school GPA threshold of 2.8. We review high school transcripts very closely for readiness. And we do have optional personal statements. Primarily what we do, though, is because we can't use certain attributes, we look at the attributes of high school districts in general. So we look and see, does the high school district that the student come from, does it have high access to dual credit? Is it in a socioeconomically depressed region of the state? And other attributes like that. It's sort of that kind of macro level rather than at the student level. And the other thing that we've done recently is we signed on to the Common App. And that it was in 2023, that increased our number of applications for students by about 35%. But really our confirmations and enrollment didn't increase by that level. We only increased about 6%. But it did increase the population of students of color, first generation and Pell students who were applying to us overall.
Thanks so much, Bill, for kicking us off. I'm going to turn it over to Julie now. Would you mind introducing yourself and talk a little bit about your center at USC and the mission and what you all are working to achieve?
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. And thanks to everyone at UERU, Julia and Steve, as well as Brian, for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. So the Center for Enrollment Research, Policy and Practice has existed for more than 15 years. Was founded by Jerry Lucido, who had been the vice president for enrollment management at University of North Carolina, then came to the University of Southern California, where he was also in that role. And then saw a pressing need within the community for two things, which he basically created a center out of, which I've now taken leadership of over the last year. Number one was the need for a space for conversation about how to do the work of enrollment management in ways that are aligned with principles of equity and diversity. This all occurred relatively close to when the 2003 decisions came down by the Supreme Court in the Gratz and Grutter cases against Michigan. And there was a big, emphasis at the time on how to do diversity within the increasingly restrictive bounds of the law. But there was a great interest among those who are responsible for admissions, for financial aid, for student success, in how to share strategies that were working, that were legally viable, and basically to sort of empower people with the solidarity and community that comes from knowing you're not actually sticking your neck out by taking this step or that within your policies and practices. The second piece was around the development of expertise within the community. So you may know that admissions has been around for more than a century, but the concept of enrollment management, which integrates admissions with financial aid as well as other services, is newer and isn't even present at some universities where they're carried out in separate offices. So developing community expertise on how to do the work of enrollment management, specifically in ways that were aligned with the values of diversity and equity that many people get into this work because they are committed to, was really the motivating factor behind this. There's a really important tension, kind of an elephant in the room to name as it concerns these issues, which is that, number one, universities have a bottom line to meet, and every single student represents a certain number of dollars toward the attainment of that bottom line. But the second is that our universities exist for multiple reasons. And one of the reasons that they exist, especially the public ones, like Washington State, is for the social mobility and the economic well-being and prosperity of the populace. And universities fail when they are so inward looking that they are only attending to the market logics. But they also struggle financially if they are thinking only and principally about the values that motivate them as individuals. So Jerry created I think a really fruitful space for open conversation about these tensions, about specific strategies, and to navigate the ever-changing legal environment. So I came on board as executive director last year, following about 20 years of research and the development of research practice partnerships that are aimed at putting scholars in communication with practitioners so that the best current knowledge is made available to the people who are doing work on the ground. I started this with enrollment and admissions issues, largely in STEM disciplines and in graduate education, but I've been working at undergraduate education for almost 20 years as well. And one of the things that we've seen is sort of what it takes to pull together people to do more than share data. A lot of it has to do with creating trust and a sense that people who are in the room together actually have each other's backs to some degree, that they care enough about each other as leaders to know that what any one of them does potentially has systemic effects. And then finally, that there's more going on than just the enrollment of individuals, that as we start to think systemically, we do that work of bringing enrollment management into greater alignment with our values. So one of the things that I'm most excited about with this center is how it is constructed to be a systemic effort at multiple levels. One, its very title about research policy and practice working in concert, and thinking as much about the connections between each of those as the individual buckets. But then also the work of enrollment management generally is about more than recruitment. It's about more than admissions. It's about more than financial aid. It's about creating systems on college campuses and university campuses that help optimize as much of those different areas of practice as possible. So yeah, we're really thrilled to be a partner in this effort and to bring the knowledge that we have developed over time to bear, both about research design, but also about how to pull together groups of practitioners in ways that are mutually beneficial.
Thank you so much for sharing, Julie. And it's wonderful that we have this panel here that we can provide both perspectives from on the university side of things and also on the other side of things of being able to support our universities and being able to enact their enrollment and admissions policies.
For sure.
And
yeah.
Yeah, and how do you see that connection, Julie, into how you can support universities? Or what what sorts of resources are you developing to help so university leaders advance equity while remaining in compliance with state and federal laws? And I'll turn it back over to you, Bill, soon to share some of those practices that you all are looking into at Washington State.
Yeah, so some of it is in a method, and then some of it is in the actual materials and resources that we develop. One is that by having high quality partnerships, we try to make the social science of these issues rapidly available and accessible and actionable to people on the ground. It's sort of notorious that academia, the white ivory tower, operates in such a way as the manuscripts are like 30 plus pages or whole books. The materials are laden with jargon and laden with methodological details that maybe are important for justifying it within a peer review process, but aren't necessarily essential for practitioners. So a lot of what my team has done over the last almost 10 years is develop a sort of methodology for doing translational work, synthesizing research, developing resource guides, policy briefs on topics related to that which practitioners and community members are most interested in, not just the researchers. But what this looks like in practice at this very moment for the people who are attending this meeting with their precious time is we're simultaneously not just doing it in the spaces where we've been active, but around the issues of how to respond to the Supreme Court decision, how to respond to anti-DEI legislation, how to navigate this time and space. So this particular effort is going to be working in close partnership with another major effort funded by the Mellon Foundation and the Kresge Foundation to generate research in this area. And then a third piece is going to be looking specifically at what upper level administrators can do to build their own capacity individually and as teams to navigate this space. So this is in partnership with Ed Council and AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They have a set of materials called Diversity in the Law, which some of you may have already seen. But we're going to be taking the Diversity in the Law materials and distilling them for admissions practitioners in the current environment so that they are equity-minded and law-attentive. And we're also going to be developing a series of videos and webinars, and then hosting convenings for people who are associated with this. So the resources are going to be asynchronous in some cases, materials that help you kind of develop your own legal literacy in the current environment so that you can interact more effectively with your general counsel, build racial literacy and other social identity literacies so that that just becomes a natural part of how you do your job. But then also how to bring together teams on your campus so that it's never just a single individual pushing for how to do this in the most legally attentive and equity-minded way, but rather you've got a group of people who are similarly equipped and can develop some strategy together. And then the last piece that I'll mention, that if it hasn't already kind of come up, is that in addition to doing the data collection efforts, we're going to be hosting this spring and then next spring convenings of the campus representatives who are part of the partnership to get them in conversation in a trusting, confidential space, but also to be eliciting some of the questions and concerns that you have that my team at USC can start acting on with respect to research, so that by the time we come back together in spring 2026, we've got some really current, theoretically informed, methodologically rich research advancements to support you all with.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to turn it over to you, Bill, to talk a little bit about, so as you mentioned, Washington State has had this ban in place for a while now. What are some ways in which Washington State has worked to expand access to higher education for all, in addition to recruitment, admissions, and financial aid? How is the university embedding its commitment to equitable access across other student programs? Big question there, but I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I think, getting to Julie's point about, how are we going to respond in this time and things like that. I think what the internal conversations kind of to lift the lid here that we've been having is, how do we stay true to our mission as an institution, right? And our mission is to provide access to the citizens of the state of Washington. And we've really started to expand that vision into different areas. I mean, the pandemic was a perfect laboratory for understanding better how do we get to populations, for instance, in the state of Washington, who traditionally have not had access to higher education. And how do we do that in an equitable and a fair manner, and more importantly, in an effective manner, which has led us to start to, challenge some of our assumptions about the way that we operate as an institution. Who has access to the institution and things like that is also really critical, key questions that we're asking. Expanding access, I think this pilot program that I told you about, the Washington Gap program, I think is a really nice experiment in how to provide access to students who come from underserved backgrounds. And by underserved backgrounds, I mean students without access. Especially in the K through 12 area. We have a lot of rural districts here in the state of Washington, many of them that are not well connected in terms of technology and other supports, despite all the efforts, to the contrary. Taking that into account as a way to expand access without having to do things like, offering automatic acceptance to the top, 3% of any high school class. It allows us to give access to students who don't fall into those narrow categories. Here locally, once we get the students here, we're expanding access and equity by, luckily we work in a state so far that has reported, they continue to support DEI. Despite Initiative 200, one of the things that our current governor has put in place is now it's mandatory that we have to do analyses of equity in higher education. And so the State Board of Council Presidents and other organizations actually monitor this at the state level and report on it publicly so that there is public knowledge about what's happening at our institutions, which I think is that stays within that spirit of DEI without ever having to go and touch that rail of DEI. It's very couched in equity and things like that is where we've moved as a state. And I think it's set us up better than some other places, unfortunately. We are having, though, those internal conversations right now about student affinity groups, student affinity areas. You know, we are right now, we're a bluer state than we used to be, but we don't know what the future is going to hold, especially at the federal level and what's coming. So we continue to monitor that space really carefully and try to provide as much equity as we can within the parameters in which we have to operate. But we know that those could shift very, very rapidly over the next several years. And so partnering with people like Julie and others is going to be really important for us to get those external perspectives and help us reframe and rethink about the way that we operate while still serving our mission.
And I think that lends well to the work that you are doing, Julie, about how you can help leaders shift their mindsets or figure out how to operate within the confines of their state and the state and federal laws that they are operating within. So I'll ask you straight up, how can leaders shift their mindset, you know, to view these laws as design parameters for DEI rather than these impenetrable barriers? You know, there's a lot of you can't, but how can you turn it into you can?
Right. Okay, well, let me start with the caveat that I am not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. Anything I share should not be presumed to count as legal guidance, you know, caveat. But that being said, there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last year, so I do feel comfortable and confident offering a few nuggets here. First and foremost, I think, you know, Bill, you mentioned something that I think is so important, that as a result of the litigious environment that we're in, being able to demonstrate non-discriminatory, fair processes maybe has never been more important. There is such scrutiny about what's being done. And there's also activity and empowerment among historically marginalized communities. For example, you may be familiar with the University of California having a lawsuit from the Compton School District, as well as some community groups in South LA, that the use of the SAT was a discriminatory measure that produced disparate impacts. And so I do think that there's an opportunity in this moment to acknowledge that even if equity and outcomes is something that is more controversial, perhaps, to pursue, that demonstrating we have equitable processes, fair processes, has really never been more important. So something that universities and leaders can and should be doing is using the external pressure that comes from these new laws and the pressure of the legal environment and the litigious environment to really make sure that we've looked under the hood, we've looked into individual units, and that there's fair, less biased, non-discriminatory processes in place. I think that's just smart, but it also ends up producing for us a more robust system than if that interrogation had never taken place. And then, you know, Victoria, I think you named something super important just now, the ability to acknowledge the power of mindsets. When the policy environment, especially the public policy environment, seems so untouchable, there are a lot of things that we can do at the organizational and individual level that are nevertheless super accessible to us. My last book was about systemic change. And one of the key things is that when you're thinking systemically, you are thinking in terms of multiple levels. And so our own mindsets and our own habits, the frames through which we look at everything, can really make a difference in terms of what become the actions that we will by default follow. Estella Ben-Simone is the progenitor of the concept equity-mindedness, and it describes the mindset of practitioners who are aware of inequalities, who take responsibility for remediating them, and who can then see within their policies and practices how they might be tweaked to become more data-driven, more systemically minded, more historically aware, more inclusive. And I think those kinds of individual practices, being data-driven, being historically minded, being aware of the everyday implications for inclusion that our activities have, that's all perfectly well within the bounds of what's acceptable. And then lastly, I think this is, you know, coming directly from Art Coleman and Jamie Lewis Keith at Ed Council. They talk a lot about acting not only within the realm of changing how we do the review of individual applications and the prompts that we ask of applicants, but thinking about all of the barriers systemically that have long needed to be addressed in our systems of financial aid, our systems of student support, and using this really as a moment to take advantage of the fact that so many people are sitting up and being willing to have that conversation who might not have otherwise. So yeah, it is a difficult time, and it kind of pains me to hear Bill you use the language of DEI as a touching that rail, because I think it highlights just how intense it is for some people right now. But yeah, the facts are that there is still always more that we can do than that we cannot.
Thank you so much. And I want to make sure we get some time for audience questions as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Bill, and then over to you, Julie, as well, to share any sort of final thoughts that you haven't had the chance to share thus far before we turn over to questions.
I guess the final thought that I would have is, I think this is one of the strengths of this project will be having a community of people to come around this subject from hopefully across the country, from many different aspects of higher education. We're all Research One universities, but the way that we operate and our missions are slightly different in many cases. And I'd love to have that conversation around, what are some of the common ways that we can overcome the challenges that we face right now in this space, and assuring equitable access to higher education. It's more important than ever.
Yeah, and
Julie?
for my part, it's spaces exactly like this. I really like that we've got like another whole half hour open to potentially just having a more general conversation with a relatively small group. I think putting people with different types of expertise and perspectives in the same room is really important during times that the tendency might be to circle the wagons, the tendency might be to focus inward. But the ability for us to find common values, find common strategies, and then go out and try some stuff and then come back together sooner rather than later to talk about it. This is how improvement has happened in many, many other social sectors. And there's a whole science of improvement science that's dedicated specifically to it. So yeah, just big props to Julia and others at UERU for creating a space like this today, because bringing these different perspectives into the same space is, I do think, one of the most important things that we can do.
Thank you. And with that, we'll turn it over to any questions that folks have. Feel free to use the raise your hand function or use the chat if you would prefer. But we have some great experts here to share their insights and wisdom, but there's also a lot of wisdom within those who are attending as well. So I offer folks reflections as well if they would like to share. Thank you, Steve.
While we're giving people a second, Steve here, I'll just reiterate what I said in the chat, which is big props to Urban Institute, to Brian Cook, particularly for leading this effort. We're really grateful for that partnership. I speak on behalf of all of the 125 universities that are members of UERU. When I say that, we're really grateful to him and to you, Victoria, and your colleagues at Urban Institute, and to Julie and her colleagues at USC. Same, we're reading those works, and we're grateful to AAS, and their body of literature and so forth. There's a lot of really great experts out there who are trying to do their level best to inform those of us on the front lines, as it were, and keep us open-minded about all the possibilities and not so overly conscious about the limitations, of which we have to be aware, and we're confronting those. But I think keeping our minds open, Bill's cases in point at Washington State do that very well. There's just an enormous range of possibilities, and we ought to explore them together experiment, and be open-minded and be willing to try new things. And I hope URU members will benefit from the research that's going on, but also benefit from the community of people who are committed to equity and excellence as simultaneous values, as inexorably woven ideas in a democratic society. And I think all our members are in fact committed to that, whether they're public, private, or urban serving, rural serving, or any kind of research university or any kind of institution of higher education is part and parcel of what makes the United States what it is. And I think, we're no less committed to that today than we were, prior to the national election. So we're just really, this is so important to us. It's so vital to what we are and to what we stand for as an undergraduate oriented group of research universities. I hope it's all right if I just drone on a bit about that, because